The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of the Silver Spoon, one of the most talked-about restaurants in downtown Atlanta. Inside, the warm lighting and elegant decor created an inviting atmosphere that had helped build the establishment's reputation over the past decade. However, on this particular Friday evening, an incident would unfold that would challenge everything the restaurant stood for. Mrs. Richardson, a successful business owner with 20 years of experience in the hospitality industry, had decided to do something she hadn't done in quite a while: dine at her own restaurant without anyone knowing who she was. She had recently been getting mixed reviews about the service, and rather than relying on second-hand information, she wanted to experience it firsthand. Dressed in casual clothes, a simple sweater and jeans, rather than her usual business attire, she looked like any other customer seeking shelter from the rain. Her naturally curly hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore minimal jewelry, nothing that would hint at her true identity as the owner of the upscale establishment. As she entered through the front door, shaking off her umbrella, she noticed immediately that no one came to greet her. She stood there for nearly 5 minutes, watching as other customers, mostly white couples in business attire, were promptly attended to by the hostess. Finally, she approached the hostess stand herself. "Excuse me," Mrs. Richardson said politely, "I'd like a table for one." The hostess, a young woman named Katie, barely glanced up from her phone. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, I don't," Mrs. Richardson replied, noting how the couple that had just been seated ahead of her hadn't been asked about reservations. "Well, we're pretty full tonight," Katie said with a dismissive tone, despite several visible empty tables. "Maybe you should try the diner down the street? Their prices might be more suitable." Mrs. Richardson felt her chest tighten at the implication, but years of business experience had taught her to maintain her composure. "I'm quite comfortable with the prices here," she said calmly. "And I can see at least 3 empty tables from where I'm standing." Katie sighed dramatically and grabbed a menu. "Fine. Follow me." She led Mrs. Richardson to a table near the kitchen doors, despite the many better tables available throughout the dining room. The constant swinging of the doors would make for an unpleasant dining experience, and Mrs. Richardson knew this was often where they seated customers they didn't particularly want to serve. As she settled into her seat, Mrs. Richardson observed the restaurant she had built from the ground up. The hand-picked artwork on the walls, the custom-designed lighting fixtures, the carefully curated wine list, all of it had been her vision. She had wanted to create a space where everyone could experience exceptional dining, regardless of their background. Yet here she sat, being treated as an unwelcome guest in her own establishment. Her server, Diane, approached the table with the same dismissive attitude as the hostess. "What do you want to drink?" she asked, not even attempting the usual warm welcome speech that was part of the restaurant's standard service protocol. "I'd love to hear about your wine selection," Mrs. Richardson said, knowing full well that servers were trained to offer detailed wine recommendations to all guests. Diane barely suppressed an eye roll. "We have red and white. House wine is $8 a glass." Mrs. Richardson kept her voice steady. "Actually, I'd like to know more about your reserve list. Perhaps the 2015 Chateau Margaux?" This caught Diane off guard. Not only had this customer named one of their most expensive wines, but she had pronounced it perfectly. That's $400 a bottle," she said, her tone suggesting she didn't believe Mrs. Richardson could afford it. "I'm aware," Mrs. Richardson replied. "I'd like a bottle, please. And I'd appreciate it if you could have your sommelier decant it properly." Diane's face flushed. I'll need to verify your payment method first." This was against restaurant policy. They never asked to verify payment before serving, especially not from their regular customers who frequently ordered expensive wines. Mrs. Richardson reached into her purse and pulled out not just her credit card, but also her business card. "I think you'll find this covers it," she said quietly, sliding both across the table. The color drained from Diane's face as she read the business card. Her hands began to shake as she realized she had been treating the owner of the silver spoon like an unwanted guest. The same owner who had written their service protocols, signed their paychecks, and built the restaurant's reputation for excellence. The next few moments seemed to move in slow motion. Diane stood frozen, holding the business card, her mouth opening and closing without forming words. Other servers began to notice something was wrong, and the dining room grew quieter as attention shifted to their table. Even Katie, who had been scrolling through her phone at the hostess stand, sensed the change in atmosphere and looked up. Mrs. Richardson remained seated, her posture perfect, her expression neutral but firm. She had spent years building this restaurant's reputation, ensuring it was a place where every guest received impeccable service. Now she had witnessed firsthand how some of her staff behaved when they thought no one was watching. The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Mrs. Richardson could hear the gentle clink of wine glasses from across the room and the muffled sounds of pots and pans from the kitchen. She took a deep breath, remembering the day she'd first opened the Silver Spoon's doors. Back then, she'd made a promise to herself that this would be a place of excellence, not just in food, but in how people were treated. "Please gather the entire front-of-house staff," she said quietly to Diane, who still stood frozen beside the table. "I'd like everyone here in 5 minutes. And yes, that includes those who aren't on shift right now. Call them back." Diane nodded frantically and rushed off, her hands trembling as she pulled out her phone to start making calls. The other servers huddled together, whispering anxiously. Katie had abandoned her post at the hostess stand, retreating to the corner where she stood fidgeting with her apron strings. Mrs. Richardson pulled out her notebook, the same one she'd used to write her first business plan 15 years ago. As she waited, she began writing, documenting everything she'd experienced since walking through the door. The 5-minute wait at the entrance. The suggestion to try the diner down the street. The table by the kitchen. The condescending tone. Each point was noted in her precise handwriting. Within minutes, staff members who had just ended their shifts began rushing back through the door, still in their uniforms. Those who lived nearby arrived breathless, as if they'd run all the way. The news had spread quickly, the owner was here, and something was very wrong. The kitchen door swung open, and Chef Robert stepped out, his face concerned. He'd worked with Mrs. Richardson for 8 years and had never seen her make an unannounced visit like this. He immediately recognized the gravity of the situation and began directing his kitchen staff to take over the front-of-house duties temporarily. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Richardson began, her voice carrying across the now hushed dining room. "I want to share a story with you. 10 years ago, I was turned away from a restaurant much like this one. The host took one look at me and decided I didn't belong there. That night, I made a promise to myself that I would create a place where everyone, would be treated with dignity and respect." She paused, looking at each staff member in turn. Some couldn't meet her eyes, while others seemed on the verge of tears. "I didn't build the Silver Spoon just to serve food. I built it to serve people. All people. When I hired each of you, you weren't just given a job, you were entrusted with my dream. Tonight, I discovered that trust has been broken." Katie, who had been trying to make herself invisible in the corner, suddenly stepped forward. Her voice was shaking, but she spoke up. "Mrs. Richardson, I had no idea. The way I treated you was. I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," Mrs. Richardson replied firmly but not unkindly. "Instead, I want you to think about something. Think about every person you've turned away with that same suggestion to try the diner down the street. Think about every guest you've seated by the kitchen doors because you decided they didn't fit your image of our clientele. Think about every time you've made someone feel less than welcome in this restaurant, in my restaurant." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Several regular customers who had witnessed the entire scene were nodding in approval, some even applauding softly. Now, Mrs. Richardson continued, I'm going to tell you what happens next. Tonight, we're closing early. Every guest currently dining will finish their meals with the excellent service they deserve. Then, we're going to have a long overdue conversation about what the silver spoon stands for. She turned to Chef Robert. Please arrange for dinner to be prepared for the entire staff. We're going to break bread together and discuss how we move forward from here. As the reality of the situation sank in, different reactions played across the faces of the staff. Some looked relieved at not being fired on the spot. Others appeared genuinely ashamed of their behavior. A few seemed to be seeing Mrs. Richardson in a completely new light. One of the senior servers, a woman who had been with the restaurant for 5 years, stepped forward. Mrs. Richardson, I need to confess something. I've seen this happening. I've seen the different treatment, the seating patterns, the rushed service for certain guests. I never spoke up. I'm as guilty as anyone else here. Mrs. Richardson nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for your honesty. That's exactly what we need right now, honesty. We need to acknowledge what's been happening here so we can fix it. She stood up, smoothing her simple sweater. I want you all to look at me right now. Really look at me. In my casual clothes, without the business suits and office, would you have believed I could afford to dine here? Would you have treated me like I belonged? These are the questions we need to answer honestly. The staff shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The truth was written clearly on their faces. Here's what's going to happen, Mrs. Richardson continued. Tomorrow, we're not opening for regular service. Instead, we're having a full-day training session. We're going to rebuild our service standards from the ground up. And for those of you wondering, yes, you're all getting paid for this training day. She paused, making eye contact with Diane and Katie. I believe in second chances, but I also believe in accountability. Starting tomorrow, we implement a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior of any kind. This isn't just about rules, it's about who we are as people and as a business. Chef Robert, who had been quietly organizing the kitchen staff to handle the remaining dinner service, approached Mrs. Richardson's table. Should I start preparing the staff dinner? Yes, please, she replied. And Robert? Make it special. Tonight needs to be memorable in every way. As the current guests finished their meals and the staff began their closing duties, there was a tangible shift in the atmosphere. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a mix of shame, determination, and hope. Mrs. Richardson remained at her table, continuing to write in her notebook, occasionally looking up to observe her staff. As the last regular customers left the Silver Spoon, the staff began rearranging the dining room. Under Chef Robert's direction, they pushed several tables together to create one long dining table, a physical representation of the unity they needed to build. The elegant tablecloths were smoothed, wine glasses positioned, and place settings arranged with the same precision they usually reserved for their most prestigious guests. The kitchen was alive with activity, but different from its usual dinner service chaos. Chef Robert had chosen to prepare a family-style meal, something that would encourage sharing and conversation. The aroma of fresh herbs and roasting vegetables filled the air, providing a comforting backdrop to what would undoubtedly be a challenging evening. Mrs. Richardson watched as her staff moved around the restaurant, their usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. They kept stealing glances at her, as if trying to reconcile the simply dressed woman at the table with the successful business owner they thought they knew. Before we begin dinner, Mrs. Richardson announced once everyone was seated, I want each of you to share a story. Not about tonight, but about a time when you felt unwelcome somewhere. Because I believe understanding comes from recognizing our shared experiences. The table fell silent. The clinking of utensils stopped. Several moments passed before one of the newer servers, a young man barely out of college, cleared his throat. I grew up in a small town, he began hesitantly. My family didn't have much money. There was this bookstore I loved, but every time I went in, the owner would follow me around, like she expected me to steal something. One day, I'd saved up enough to buy this expensive art book I'd been eyeing for months. When I took it to the counter, she asked me 3 times if I was sure I could afford it. Heads nodded around the table. The story had broken the ice, and others began to share their experiences. Katie, who had been staring at her plate, suddenly spoke up. "My grandmother is in a wheelchair," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Last year, we went to a fancy restaurant for her birthday. The host acted like she was an inconvenience, made a big show of rearranging tables. Made her feel like she was causing problems just by being there." She paused, wiping her eyes. "And here I am, doing the same thing to others. Making them feel unwelcome in their own city, their own community." The food began arriving, platters of perfectly roasted chicken, colorful vegetable dishes, fresh bread still warm from the oven. But no one moved to serve themselves. The weight of confession and recognition held them in place. Diane, who had been unusually quiet, finally found her voice. "You know what's worse? I've been on both sides. Growing up, my family faced discrimination all the time. I promised myself I'd never make anyone feel that way. But somewhere along the line, I started doing exactly what had been done to me. When did I become the person I used to resent?" Mrs. Richardson let the conversations flow naturally, watching as her staff began to open up, to acknowledge their biases, to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The sharing of food became a ceremony of sorts, passing dishes, filling each other's glasses, small acts of service that took on new meaning in light of their discussions. "I have a question," one of the bartenders ventured. "How do we fix this? Really fix it, I mean. Because saying, treat everyone equally sounds simple, but clearly, we've all been carrying these unconscious biases without even realizing it." Mrs. Richardson put down her fork and looked around the table. "That's exactly the right question. And the answer starts with awareness, which we're building right now. But it also requires action. Real, concrete changes in how we operate." She pulled out her notebook and opened it to a fresh page. "Let's create new protocols together. Not just rules to follow, but a new vision for what service means at the Silver Spoon. I want to hear your ideas." The energy in the room shifted. Staff members who had been hesitant to speak began offering suggestions. Ideas flowed freely, everything from revising the seating chart system to implementing regular sensitivity training. Someone suggested creating a feedback system where staff could anonymously report discriminatory behavior they witnessed. "What about our regulars?" someone asked. "Some of them, well, they expect certain types of treatment. They might not like changes that make the restaurant more inclusive." Mrs. Richardson's response was immediate and firm. "Then they'll need to adjust or find somewhere else to dine. The Silver Spoon's future is one of genuine hospitality for all, not exclusive privilege for some." As the evening progressed, Chef Robert brought out dessert, a beautiful array of small pastries and fruit tarts. The sharing of sweets seemed to lighten the mood slightly, though the serious undertone remained. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Richardson announced, "we begin our retraining. But tonight has been the most important step, acknowledging our mistakes and committing to change. I want you all to go home and reflect on everything we've discussed. Write down your thoughts, your fears, your hopes for what this restaurant can become." She stood up, looking at each person in turn. "The Silver Spoon has always been more than just a restaurant to me. It's a dream of what hospitality should be, genuine, warm, and inclusive. Tonight showed me that we've strayed from that dream, but it also showed me that we have the courage to find our way back." The staff began to rise, preparing to leave for the night. Many approached Mrs. Richardson personally, offering tearful apologies and heartfelt thanks for the second chance. As they filed out into the night, there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted. Katie was the last to leave. She lingered by the door, then turned back. "Mrs. Richardson? Thank you. Not just for not firing us, but for making us face this. I won't let you down again." Left alone in the restaurant, Mrs. Richardson walked through the quiet dining room. She stopped at each table, straightening already straight chairs, adjusting perfectly positioned settings. This wasn't just about running a successful business anymore. It was about creating real change, one meal, one guest, one moment at a time. The next morning arrived with a sense of nervous anticipation. The Silver Spoon staff gathered in the dining room at 8 a.m. sharp, the usual bustle of opening preparations replaced by quiet determination. The tables had been rearranged into a classroom-style setup, with notepads and pens at each place. Mrs. Richardson had been there since dawn, preparing for what might be the most important day in her restaurant's history. She'd brought in Dr. Chen, a renowned hospitality consultant specializing in inclusive service training. Together, they had crafted a program that would challenge and transform her team's approach to customer service. "Yesterday, we confronted some uncomfortable truths," Mrs. Richardson began, standing before her assembled staff. "Today, we learn how to do better. Not just as servers or hosts or bartenders, but as human beings." Dr. Chen stepped forward, her presence both authoritative and approachable. "We're going to start with an exercise," she announced. "I want each of you to close your eyes and imagine walking into a restaurant. You're celebrating a special occasion. You've saved up for months. But from the moment you enter, you're treated like an inconvenience. Every interaction makes you feel smaller, less worthy. Open your eyes. How many of you have actually experienced this?" Nearly every hand in the room went up. "Now," she continued, "how many of you have inadvertently made others feel this way?" The hands stayed up, accompanied by looks of shame and recognition. The morning session focused on unconscious bias training. Through role-playing exercises and frank discussions, the staff began to recognize their own prejudices. Katie, who had been particularly affected by the previous night's revelations, volunteered to demonstrate proper hosting protocols. "The key," Dr. Chen explained, "is consistency. Every guest gets the same warm welcome, the same attention to detail, the same quality of service. No exceptions, no assumptions." During the lunch break, Chef Robert had prepared a special meal, but with a twist, each staff member was served differently. Some received elaborate presentations, others got the same food plated carelessly. The exercise drove home how subtle differences in service could impact the dining experience. The afternoon brought practical training. Mrs. Richardson introduced new service protocols, developed based on the previous night's discussions. The reservation system would now be strictly first come, first served, with no special treatment based on perceived status. Seating arrangements would follow a rotation system, ensuring equal distribution of tables throughout the dining room. "But what about regulars who specifically request certain tables?" one server asked. "We'll explain our new policies politely but firmly," Mrs. Richardson responded. True hospitality means creating an environment where everyone feels equally valued. The staff practiced handling difficult situations through role-play scenarios. They learned to recognize and address discriminatory requests from customers, developed strategies for supporting colleagues who witnessed unfair treatment, and worked on creating inclusive language for their service interactions. As the day progressed, something remarkable happened. The initial tension began to dissolve, replaced by genuine engagement and determination. Staff members who had rarely spoken up before were now actively participating, offering suggestions and sharing insights. One of the bartenders proposed creating a system of subtle signals staff could use to alert each other when they noticed problematic behavior. A server suggested developing a collection of local recommendations that went beyond the usual tourist spots, ensuring they could guide guests to diverse experiences throughout the city. Late in the afternoon, Mrs. Richardson unveiled the final component of their transformation, a complete revision of their hiring practices. Moving forward, our team will reflect the diversity of our community, she announced. We're implementing blind initial applications and structured interviews to ensure fair evaluation of all candidates. The training day concluded with each staff member writing a personal commitment statement. These would be sealed in envelopes and opened in 3 months during their first formal review of the new policies. Tomorrow, Mrs. Richardson said, we reopen our doors. Everything we've learned will be put to the test. There will be challenges. Some customers might resist the changes. But remember, we're not just serving food, we're serving our values. Dr. Chen added a final thought: change isn't just about big moments like today. It's about the small decisions you make every minute of every shift. Each interaction is an opportunity to prove that genuine hospitality knows no boundaries. As the staff prepared to leave, there was a palpable sense of purpose in the air. They had spent the day not just learning new procedures, but confronting their own biases and discovering ways to be better. The theoretical had become personal. Katie approached Mrs. Richardson before leaving. I've been thinking about my grandmother, she said. About how she felt that day at that other restaurant. I'm going to invite her to dine here next week. I want her to see what real hospitality looks like. Diane, who had been quiet most of the day, joined them. Would it be okay if I served her table? I want to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I can be the kind of server I should have been all along. Mrs. Richardson smiled warmly at both of them. That's exactly the kind of initiative and personal responsibility I've been hoping to see. This isn't just about following new rules, it's about understanding why these changes matter and making them part of who we are. As the last staff member left, Mrs. Richardson and Dr. Chen sat down to review the day's progress. The real test would come tomorrow when they reopened, but something fundamental had shifted. The staff weren't just going through the motions of training, they were embracing the opportunity for genuine change. They're ready, Dr. Chen said confidently. The key now is consistency and follow-through. Mrs. Richardson nodded, looking around her empty restaurant. Tomorrow, these tables would be full again, but this time, every guest would experience the true meaning of hospitality. The Silver Spoon was about to embark on a new chapter, one where excellence in service meant excellence in human dignity. The morning of the reopening brought with it a mix of excitement and anxiety. The staff arrived early, each person double-checking their stations with unusual thoroughness. The dining room gleamed, the table settings were perfect, and the kitchen hummed with preparation. But there was something different in the air, a sense of purpose that went beyond the usual pre-service routine. Mrs. Richardson stood at the host station with Katie, reviewing the new seating chart one final time. Remember, she said gently, every guest is a VIP guest. No exceptions. The first test came minutes after opening. A well-dressed couple walked in, regulars who had been coming to the Silver Spoon for years. They always insisted on table 15, a corner spot with a view of the garden. But today, that table was already assigned to another reservation. I'm sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton, Katie said, her voice steady despite her nerves. While we value your patronage, we've implemented a new seating system. I have a lovely table for you by the window, or we can add you to the waiting list for the next available corner table. The couple exchanged surprised looks. Mrs. Hamilton's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her handbag. But we always sit at table 15. Surely you can make an arrangement? Katie glanced at Mrs. Richardson, who gave her an encouraging nod. Our new policy ensures fair seating for all our guests. I apologize, but we can't make exceptions. Would you like to see the window table? The view of the sunset from there is spectacular. For a moment, it seemed the Hamiltons might leave. But something in Katie's genuine smile and professional demeanor made them pause. Very well, Mr. Hamilton said finally. Show us this sunset view. As the morning progressed, the staff faced similar challenges with grace. Diane, handling a large party in her section, provided the same attentive service to every guest, regardless of who ordered the expensive wines and who stuck to water. The kitchen maintained its high standards for every dish, plating each with equal care whether it was a simple salad or a premium steak. Around noon, an elderly woman in a wheelchair arrived with her family. Katie's heart skipped a beat. It was her grandmother, accompanied by her parents. She hadn't expected them until next week. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward to greet them properly. "Welcome to the Silver Spoon," she said, her voice warm and professional. She smoothly guided them through the dining room, ensuring her grandmother had plenty of space to maneuver her wheelchair. Other staff members instinctively moved chairs and created clear paths without making a fuss. Diane, true to her word, had requested to serve their table. She approached with genuine warmth, taking time to explain the menu specials, making eye contact with each person, and paying particular attention to ensuring Katie's grandmother felt comfortable and included. The lunch service continued smoothly until a difficult situation arose. A guest at one of the center tables made a loud, discriminatory comment about a nearby party. The old staff might have ignored it, but today was different. The server, remembering their training, politely but firmly addressed the situation. "Sir," they said quietly but clearly, "at the Silver Spoon, we believe in creating a welcoming environment for all our guests. I must ask you to refrain from such comments, or we'll have to ask you to leave." The guest bristled, demanding to speak to the owner. Mrs. Richardson stepped forward immediately. "I am the owner," she said, "and I fully support my staff's position. We'll be happy to present your check now if you're uncomfortable with our policies." The incident, though tense, had a surprising effect on the other diners. Several nearby tables nodded in approval. One guest later wrote a note on their receipt, "Thank you for standing up for what's right. We'll be back." As the afternoon turned to evening, word began to spread about the changes at the Silver Spoon. Social media buzzed with positive comments about the inclusive atmosphere and exceptional service. Regular customers noticed the difference, not just in how they were treated, but in the overall energy of the restaurant. In the kitchen, Chef Robert maintained his usual high standards while implementing his own changes. He'd started mentoring a young dishwasher who had expressed interest in cooking, breaking down the hierarchical barriers that often existed in professional kitchens. During the dinner rush, a food critic arrived unannounced, one known for being particularly demanding. The staff handled her table with the same professional courtesy they'd shown every other guest that day. No special treatment, just genuine, attentive service. Mrs. Richardson watched from a distance as her team rose to each new challenge. She saw Katie confidently managing the flow of guests, Diane providing warm, professional service to every table, and the entire staff working together with a new sense of purpose. Near closing time, Katie's grandmother stopped by the host station. "You know," she said, taking her granddaughter's hand, "I've been to many restaurants in my life. But today was the first time I felt truly welcomed, not just accommodated." The staff meeting after closing had a different tone than usual. Instead of exhausted complaints, there was a sense of accomplishment. They discussed the day's challenges openly, sharing strategies that worked and brainstorming solutions for difficulties they'd encountered. "I had a table ask why their usual server wasn't hovering over them like before," one server shared. "I explained that we aim to provide attentive but equal service to all our guests. They actually thanked me by the end of their meal." Mrs. Richardson closed the meeting by reading some of the comment cards they'd received throughout the day. Many praised the professional service, but more importantly, they noted the genuine warmth and inclusive atmosphere. Today was just the beginning, she reminded her team. Real change happens over time, with consistency and commitment. But I'm proud of how far we've come already. As the staff filed out, tired but satisfied, Mrs. Richardson noticed Katie and her grandmother still chatting by the door. The young hostess who had once thoughtlessly turned guests away was now enthusiastically describing their new policies to her grandmother, who listened with obvious pride. The Silver Spoon had taken its first steps toward becoming the restaurant Mrs. Richardson had always envisioned, not just a place of fine dining, but a space where genuine hospitality meant treating everyone with equal dignity and respect. Word spread quickly through Atlanta's dining scene about the changes at the Silver Spoon. 3 weeks after the reopening, local food bloggers had begun writing about more than just the excellent cuisine. They were talking about the restaurant's transformation into a model of inclusive hospitality. One rainy Tuesday evening, Mrs. Richardson sat in her office reviewing the past week's comments and reports. The reservation list had grown more diverse, with guests from all walks of life feeling welcome to experience fine dining. More importantly, the staff had maintained their commitment to equal, excellent service for everyone. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. It was the owner of Bella Vista, another upscale restaurant in the city. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by," he said, taking a seat. "But I've been hearing things. Good things. About what you're doing here." Mrs. Richardson listened as he described similar issues at his restaurant. "How did you manage the transition?" he asked. "Especially with long-time customers who expect certain privileges?" "By remembering that true hospitality isn't about privilege," she replied. "It's about dignity. Would you like to see how we're doing it?" She led him to the dining room, where the evening service was in full swing. Katie was at the host station, warmly greeting an elderly couple while simultaneously arranging accessible seating for a guest with a walker. The couple had to wait briefly, but they smiled understanding at the host's thoughtful attention to the other guests' needs. Diane moved efficiently between tables, her service style transformed. Gone was the subtle discrimination that had once characterized her work. Instead, she treated each guest with the same refined attention, whether they ordered the chef's tasting menu with wine pairings or simply enjoyed a single course. At the bar, the atmosphere had changed too. The bartender was describing their craft cocktails with equal enthusiasm to everyone, from the young professionals trying their first high-end Manhattan to the seasoned regulars who knew their spirits well. "Watch this," Mrs. Richardson said quietly to her colleague. They observed as a group of young diners, clearly saving up for a special occasion, was seated at one of the best tables in the house. The sommelier approached their table with the same respect and attention he would show to any wine connoisseur, patiently explaining options in their price range without a hint of condescension. "We're actually seeing higher sales," Mrs. Richardson explained. "When people feel truly welcome, they come back. They bring friends. They celebrate special occasions here because they know everyone in their party will be treated with respect." Their conversation was interrupted by an unexpected situation. A regular customer was insisting on being seated immediately, despite arriving late for his reservation. The host, a newer staff member, handled it beautifully. "Sir, I absolutely understand your frustration," he said calmly. "However, our policy ensures fair treatment for all our guests. Your table was held for 15 minutes, as we do for everyone, and was then given to the next party. I can offer you the next available table, which should be ready in about 20 minutes. The customer, initially upset, paused at the professional handling of the situation. Looking around, he noticed other well-dressed diners waiting patiently in the bar area. The clear, fair policy had transformed what could have been a confrontation into an acceptance of equal treatment. Later that evening, Mrs. Richardson received an unexpected visitor, the food critic who had dined with them on reopening day. She had returned unannounced several times since then. "I'm writing a feature," the critic explained, "not just about the food, which has always been excellent, but about what you're doing here. This is more than just a policy change, you're changing the culture of fine dining in our city." She shared stories she'd gathered from various guests, a young couple celebrating their engagement who felt truly special despite their modest wine selection, a group of international business visitors who praised the staff's cultural sensitivity, a family celebrating their grandmother's birthday who appreciated the thoughtful accommodation of her dietary restrictions. The kitchen staff had evolved as well. Chef Robert's mentorship program had expanded, creating opportunities for staff members to learn and grow regardless of their background. The young dishwasher he'd taken under his wing was now handling basic prep work, showing remarkable talent. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Richardson gathered her staff for their nightly meeting. These sessions had become more than just service reviews, they were opportunities for sharing experiences and learning from each other. "Something interesting happened today," one server shared. "A guest asked why we don't have a dress code anymore. I explained that we focus on making everyone feel welcome while maintaining our high standards of service and cuisine. They thought about it, then said they actually preferred it this way." The staff discussed how their personal views had evolved. Katie spoke about how her grandmother had become a regular, bringing friends from her retirement community who had never felt comfortable in fine dining establishments before. Diane shared how her tips had actually increased since she started providing consistently excellent service to all guests. Another server mentioned overhearing guests from another upscale restaurant discussing the silver spoon's changes. They were saying their regular place feels outdated now, stuck in old-fashioned attitudes. They appreciated how we've modernized the fine dining experience. Mrs. Richardson smiled, remembering her conversation with the Bella Vista owner. Change was spreading, one restaurant at a time. The Silver Spoon was becoming known not just for its food and service, but for its leadership in creating a more inclusive dining culture. As the meeting concluded, she shared some exciting news. "The Chamber of Commerce has asked us to lead a workshop for other restaurants about inclusive hospitality. They want to make our city known for welcoming all diners. Who would like to help present?" Nearly every hand went up. The staff who had once perpetuated exclusionary practices were now eager to help others learn from their transformation. Their journey had become a source of pride, a model for change in an industry often resistant to it. Looking around at her team, Mrs. Richardson felt a deep satisfaction. The Silver Spoon had always served excellent food, but now it was serving something even more important: dignity, respect, and true hospitality for all. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Convention Center buzzed with anticipation. Restaurant owners, managers, and staff from across the city had gathered for the Chamber of Commerce's first inclusive hospitality workshop. At the center of it all stood Mrs. Richardson and her team from the Silver Spoon, ready to share their journey. The past 2 months had transformed not just their restaurant, but their understanding of what hospitality truly meant. As Mrs. Richardson looked out at the crowd, she recognized faces from many of the city's finest establishments, all eager to learn from their experience. Katie stepped up to the podium first, her confidence a far cry from the dismissive hostess she'd once been. "6 months ago," she began, "I thought I knew what good service meant. I was wrong. Let me tell you about the day that changed everything." The audience listened intently as she shared her story, including the painful truth about her previous behavior and her transformation. When she spoke about her grandmother becoming a regular guest, her voice filled with pride. "We're not just serving food anymore," she concluded. "We're serving dignity." Diane followed, addressing the sensitive topic of unconscious bias in service. She outlined specific situations and how to handle them, sharing real examples from their experience. "Your most prestigious guest," she explained, "isn't the one with the expensive watch or designer clothes. It's every single person who chooses to dine with you." Chef Robert presented next, discussing how the kitchen's culture had evolved. He brought up his young protégé, now a promising line cook, as an example of what could happen when opportunities were truly open to all. "Talent doesn't check a dress code at the door," he said, earning knowing laughs from the audience. During the break, restaurant owners crowded around Mrs. Richardson, sharing their own challenges and asking for advice. The owner of a popular bistro admitted that her staff struggled with similar issues. "How did you handle the transition period?" she asked. "Especially with longtime customers?" "By being consistent," Mrs. Richardson replied. "When you believe in what you're doing, when you know it's right, that conviction carries through to your staff and your guests. The afternoon sessions focused on practical implementation. The Silver Spoon team demonstrated their new reservation and seating systems, training protocols, and methods for handling difficult situations. They shared their mistakes and lessons learned, making the path easier for those who would follow. A young restaurant manager raised his hand during the Q&A. "We've tried to be more inclusive," he said, "but some of our regular customers complain. They say we're lowering our standards." Mrs. Richardson smiled. "Standards aren't about exclusivity," she replied. "They're about excellence. Our food is still exceptional, our service impeccable. We've simply removed the artificial barriers that kept some people from experiencing that excellence." The workshop's impact became evident almost immediately. Within weeks, other restaurants began implementing similar changes. The local restaurant association created a certification program for inclusive hospitality, with the Silver Spoon helping to develop the criteria. One evening, about a week after the workshop, Mrs. Richardson walked through her dining room, observing the subtle but significant changes. A young family celebrating a graduation sat near a table of business executives. A couple who had saved for months for their anniversary dinner enjoyed the same attentive service as the regulars at the bar. The food critic who had covered their transformation stopped by again, this time with exciting news. "Your story has gone national," she announced. "Other cities are taking notice. They want to know how Atlanta's fine dining scene became a model of inclusive excellence." The staff gathered for their evening meeting, sharing stories about the workshop's ripple effects. One server had helped train staff at her friend's restaurant. Katie had been invited to speak at a hospitality school about modern guest relations. Chef Robert was developing a mentorship program that other restaurants could implement. "But here's what really matters," Diane said, sharing a letter from a guest. This person wrote that they'd never felt comfortable in fine dining restaurants before. They'd always felt judged, out of place. But here, they felt like they belonged. That's what we're really serving, belonging. The meeting was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, the same couple Mrs. Richardson had encountered on that fateful night, the ones Diane had initially treated poorly. They had become regular guests, but tonight was special. "We're opening our own restaurant," they announced. "And we want to do it right, from the start. Would you be willing to consult with us? Help us build a place that welcomes everyone?" Mrs. Richardson looked at her team, seeing the pride in their faces. The Silver Spoon had become more than just a success story, it was becoming the seed of a movement. Other restaurants were beginning to understand that true hospitality meant creating spaces where everyone could experience excellence. The next morning, Mrs. Richardson arrived early, as she often did, to enjoy the quiet of her restaurant before the day began. She walked through the dining room, remembering that night when she'd decided to test her own establishment. The pain of that experience had led to something extraordinary. A note caught her eye, someone had slipped it under the door. It was from a young server at another restaurant who had attended the workshop. "You've changed how I see my job," it read. "Yesterday, I stood up to a manager who wanted to seat some guests by the kitchen just because of how they looked. I remembered what you said about dignity. Thank you for showing us a better way." As her staff began arriving for the day, Mrs. Richardson gathered them together. "Look around this room," she said. "Remember how it used to be, and look at what we've created together. But don't get comfortable. We're not just maintaining a restaurant anymore, we're nurturing a vision of what hospitality can be. Every guest who walks through that door is part of our story now." The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the crystal glasses and polished silver. Another day was beginning at the Silver Spoon, where excellence meant more than perfect service and exquisite food. It meant creating a space where everyone could feel the simple, profound dignity of being welcomed. 1 year had passed since that rainy evening when Mrs. Richardson walked into her own restaurant and discovered the truth about its service. The Silver Spoon was celebrating its anniversary of transformation, but this celebration was different from any they'd held before. The restaurant hummed with activity as staff prepared for the evening's special event. Instead of their usual service, they were hosting a community dinner that would bring together people from all walks of life. The usual fine dining setup had been replaced with long, communal tables that encouraged conversation and connection. Mrs. Richardson stood in the doorway, watching as Katie expertly directed the preparations. The young hostess who had once turned people away was now training other restaurant staff in inclusive hospitality. Her grandmother had become something of a local celebrity, regularly bringing groups from her retirement community and other seniors who had previously felt intimidated by fine dining. Diane passed by, carrying a stack of special menus. She had recently been promoted to dining room manager, her natural leadership abilities flourishing in their transformed environment. Under her guidance, the service staff had developed a reputation for making every guest feel like they belonged. "Remember when we used to judge people the moment they walked in?" Diane said, pausing beside Mrs. Richardson. "Now I can't imagine treating anyone as less than special. It feels like a different lifetime." The kitchen doors swung open as Chef Robert emerged with his protégé, now a respected sous chef. Together, they had created a menu for tonight that celebrated diversity, dishes that honored various cultural traditions while maintaining the silver spoon standard of excellence. The young chef had recently started a mentorship program of his own, passing forward the opportunity he'd been given. As evening approached, guests began to arrive. The sight brought tears to Mrs. Richardson's eyes. Business executives sat beside school teachers. A group of young artists who had once felt out of place in fine dining establishments chatted comfortably with retired professionals. Katie's grandmother held court at one table, surrounded by a mix of regular guests and newcomers. The Hamiltons, who had once insisted on their special table, now sat wherever they were placed, having embraced the restaurant's transformation. They had become vocal advocates for inclusive dining, often bringing friends who might have felt unwelcome in upscale restaurants before. Mrs. Richardson took her place at the center of the room, gently tapping her glass for attention. "1 year ago," she began, "we embarked on a journey that would change not just this restaurant, but our entire perspective on hospitality. We learned that excellence isn't about exclusivity, it's about creating spaces where everyone can experience the very best we have to offer." She gestured to the diverse crowd before her. "Look around this room. This is what true hospitality looks like. It's not about white tablecloths or expensive wines, though we're proud to offer both. It's about dignity. About belonging. About treating every person who walks through our doors as someone worthy of our very best service." The food critic who had covered their initial transformation stood up. "What started in this room has spread across our city," she announced. "Dozens of restaurants have followed the Silver Spoon's lead. Our dining scene is becoming known not just for its cuisine, but for its culture of genuine welcome." As dinner was served, the room filled with conversation and laughter. Staff members moved smoothly between tables, providing the same impeccable service to everyone. Chef Robert's menu told a story of inclusion through food, each dish representing the harmony of different culinary traditions. A young couple celebrating their engagement shared their story. They had chosen the Silver Spoon because they'd heard it was a place where they wouldn't be judged by their budget. "We felt like royalty," the young woman said, "even though we only ordered appetizers and shared a dessert." Later in the evening, Mrs. Richardson noticed Katie in deep conversation with a group of restaurant owners who had attended their workshop. They were discussing how their own establishments had changed after implementing inclusive practices. "Our revenues are up," one owner reported, "but more importantly, our staff is happier. They're proud to work somewhere that stands for something." As the night drew to a close, Mrs. Richardson gathered her team for a final reflection. "When I walked in here that rainy night," she said, "I was heartbroken by what I discovered. But look what grew from that pain. We didn't just change our policies, we changed hearts and minds, including our own." Diane spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "I used to think success in this business meant catering to the elite. Now I know it means creating a place where everyone can experience excellence. That's true hospitality." The young sous chef added his perspective. "In the kitchen, we used to focus only on the food. Now we understand that every dish we create is part of making someone feel welcomed and valued. That makes our work even more meaningful." As the last guests departed, many stopping to share their own stories of feeling truly welcome, Mrs. Richardson walked through her transformed restaurant. The long tables would be replaced tomorrow with their regular setup, but the spirit of community would remain. She paused by the host station where it had all begun. A framed mission statement now hung there, crafted together by the staff. "At the Silver Spoon, we believe that true excellence lies in creating a space where every guest can experience the dignity of being genuinely welcomed. Our commitment to exceptional food and service is matched only by our commitment to treating each person who walks through our doors with equal respect and care." The next morning, as she prepared to open for another day of service, Mrs. Richardson received a letter. It was from a National Restaurant Association, inviting her to speak at their annual conference about transforming restaurant culture. But more meaningful than the invitation were the dozens of letters that had come with it, stories from people across the country who had experienced discrimination in restaurants and saw hope in the Silver Spoon's example. "We're not finished," she told her staff at their morning meeting. "This is just the beginning. Every person who dines with us carries our message of inclusion back to their own communities. Every restaurant that changes its practices creates new spaces where people can feel valued. We're not just serving meals anymore, we're serving hope." As they prepared for another day of service, Mrs. Richardson looked at her transformed team with pride. The rain had stopped, and morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the dining room where so many barriers had been broken, so many lives touched, so many lessons learned. The Silver Spoon had become more than a restaurant, it was a beacon of change, showing that true hospitality knows no bounds.